Okay, we are go. Let me share real quick. Okay, so Du Bois. He was according to multiple scholars today, he is essentially the founder of American sociology, although he doesn't really get credit for it. You'll often see sociology being credited to the Chicago School, with some scholars like Park or Mead. But even before these scholars, Du Bois was working and actually doing so much empirical work that he was ahead of his time about 80 years. So he argued that race was something socially constructed and was constructed in power dynamics. And that's not something that really took hold in mainstream social science until the 1960s and 70s. And he was writing in the 1890s. So, really ahead of his time in how he thought about the world and how he analyzed the world. And so, I wanted to make sure that we not only read his popular The Souls of Black Folk, but that we read some of his really academically substantial books. Not that The Souls of Black Folk wasn't academically substantial, but it was definitely written towards a more popular audience. So, we'll be, as I wrote in the reading guide, you're going to be reading 3 of his works. One that was an academic article, then the first chapter of The Souls of Black Folk, and then the Black Reconstruction with, just to give you an idea, I don't know if you can see me, but it is this thick. So it's pretty big. It's not a short one, and we're only reading the last 2 chapters, and I wish we could just spend a whole class reading this book because it's incredible. Let's start by talking about Du Bois' sociology. These are 2 graphs that Du Bois actually created in his work, so that you can see how colorful it is. You can also see that he took a lot of time to color this, to design it, and to do things in really interesting ways that would grasp people's attention and imagination. I'll let you look at those more when you download the PowerPoint, but I'll have a couple more of these scattered throughout. But we're going to start on how he understands what sociology is, and essentially he's looking to push an objective analysis of the social world. So he starts out the annals piece on the study of Negro problems by saying a social problem is the failure of an organized social group to realize its group ideals through the inability to adapt a certain desired line of action to given conditions of life. So there's a lot going on in this single definition. But in your own work, a social problem will be a specific thing that Du Bois is looking at. And so when you look at, specific Du Bois concept, this could be one. So he's looking at an organized social group, and he doesn't specify how it's organized. It could be either an organized by socioeconomic status, by class, by a social movement. But this social group has ideals, it has goals and desires. And a social problem is when this group cannot gain that ideal and adapt any kind of action depending on the social context. So what he's going to be talking about specifically is, quote unquote, the Negro problem, or the inability of African Americans to realize their goals, but because they were unable to adapt to a certain action given the social context at the time. So to go a little more academically in depth on what a problem is, so a social problem is the relation between conditions and action. So do you have agency given a social condition? So let's say today in this economic, racial, gendered context, are you able to act in a way that gives you the ability to reach your goals? So he furthers by saying, when we talk of the Negro problem, students must recognize the obvious facts that this problem, like others, has a long historical development, is not one problem, but rather a plexus of social problems, and that these problems have their own one bond of unity in the act that they group themselves about those Africans whom 2 centuries of slave trading brought into the land. So he also is saying that when you study social problems, you need to analyze their historical development. It can't be something that simply you're looking at right now, but something that has happened over time. When I did my research with LGBT homeless young adults, I realized that a lot of what I was seeing actually had its historical foundations in the 1910s when the United States started producing welfare policies in different states, and as those became foundational in the nation at large. And I couldn't explain what was happening in 2020 without discussing what had been happening from 1910 to today. And that's kind of what Du Bois is saying, is that you can't just look at what's happening now, but you have to trace back its historical development. And so he says there are 3 things you need to do to study social problems. First, you need to analyze how the social environment is affecting the forces that create and affect the social problem. So really looking at the social context that constrains social action. Second, you need to trace the historical development like we just read and discover probable future trends. So what's going to happen next? And this is something that's unique to Du Bois, and maybe a little bit to Weber, but a lot of the sociologists that will study going forward don't try to analyze the future. They don't try to give us a guess for what's going on. But Du Bois, in almost every one of his writings, tries to give, based on this analysis, here's what I see going forward, or here's, especially since he was so involved in politics and civil rights, he would give an analysis of how the Black movement needs to continue in order to gain equality. And then finally, he says that to study social problems, you need to have a purpose in advancing science. So it can't just be analyzing the problems for the problem's sake, but it has to be for the cause of advancing science. And he has a really interesting reasoning for this. Oh, I don't have it here. He says that you have to come into the study of social problems completely unbiased, and thus you need to only be answering the scientific question first, and then you can apply it to social reform. Otherwise, if you go in with the idea of social reform, all of the biases and the loaded social environments will muddy the study and muddy the analysis until it comes out. And he even says, think of how many social scientists have ruined this world, right? And we can even think of things like eugenics, of craniology, how a lot of these well-intentioned social scientists came in to study social problems and made them worse because all they did was adapt the racist ideas of the time and fit it into a particular scientific method. So he's saying, instead, drop all of that and just look at the science. And then once you've come to conclusions, you can bring it into the space of social reform. Any questions on how Du Bois sees the general idea of sociology and how to go through it?
No.
Okay. So let's dig into how he specifically looks at the Negro problem. This is something that he starts talking about largely because of the politics of the time. Booker T. Washington was talking about the Negro problem, and how for Booker T. Washington it was, let's give the African Americans menial labor jobs, and maybe over time they can demonstrate that they are good enough to enter society. Du Bois found that offensive, and he was like, no, we just need to come into it now. And so let's see how he defined the Negro problem and what that looks like. So this is going to come a lot from both the Annals book or the Annals article and the Souls of Black Folk. So he wrote that the Negro problem was defined as the segregated mass of 8 millions of Americans who do not wholly share the national life of the people and are not integral part of the social body. So the whole, remember, in our previous question, let me go back to it. He defined a social problem as the failure of an organized social group to realize its goals because the social conditions restricted their actions. And so he's saying that the social conditions are that 8 millions of Americans are completely segregated, both nationally and socially. And he says there are two reasons for this. The first is that he says, as a mass, African Americans have not reached a sufficiently high grade of culture. And what he means by culture is like in things of education, and in like a common identity and purpose. And there were a lot of other African American scholars at the time who had an issue with how he talked about this, especially African American women who were like, I'm educated, I just can't, if I speak up in public, then I'm going to be shot. So there was a lot of people who felt that he was still a little bit diminishing of the larger African American community. But again, we're looking at exactly how he was thinking of it. First, that African Americans had not reached a sufficiently high grade of culture to integrate themselves into society. But also there is this larger American conviction that people of African American blood should not be admitted into the group life of the nation, no matter what their grade of culture is. So regardless of if they were the most gentle, if they were the smartest, if they were the most laborious, they would never be allowed to enter the social body. So this is how he sees the two structural causes of the quote-unquote Negro problem. In the Souls of Black Folk, we read how this has a structural foundation, kind of what we just talked about, but also a psychological effect. So he talks about the veil a lot in the Souls of Black Folk, and what he is talking about is that on one hand, the veil is a segregated and material divide between white America and Black America, that they are both intellectually and physically separated. And what this does is it creates unique psychological effects on both Black and white Americans. And we'll get to the white Americans later on, but in the Souls of Black Folk, he specifically talks about this double consciousness, which is the forcing of Black Americans to see themselves and the nation through the dominant view, the dominant worldview. And this could create a lot of problems. It could make you hate yourself. It could, have some internalized racism. And he might say things similarly about Booker T. Washington, that he might have had some internalized racism. But it also provides African Americans with the ability to critically analyze the veil and realize that the structure of the veil is a social construct and not necessary, that it's something that could be taken apart, something that could be broken up, and that true integration or true equality, at least, is possible. And so this is something that the veil provides the African Americans as a second sight or an ability to be critical of the structures of the United States. Before we move on, is there any question about that? Okay.
No.
Yeah, feel free to
No,
stop
sorry.
me at any point. So, one of the things that really surprises a lot of readers of Du Bois is that he is he actually argues that class has a stronger foundation for the separation between black and white Americans than race. And so he argues in the Annals article that the Negro problem started out as a labor problem, that the U.S. Agriculture needed labor and they brought in slaves, but they didn't see it as um, a race issue. They saw it as we need laborers. And so we're bringing in these people to be laborers. And there wasn't much of a distinction between slaves and indentured servitude. It was often just, here are laborers. Over time, as both the economic necessity required more output and the more and more slaves tried to escape and tried to run away, um, the powers at be, so to speak, in the US created the issue of race and color to be able to, segregate the enslaved or the escaped slave from the rest of society and make it less likely that African Americans were able to escape and to, enter society at large. So he says the question of race assumed a new and peculiar importance when it thus lay at the basis of some of the world's greatest industries. So race was inherently tied to the Industrial Revolution, to the economic status of the United States. And without that obsession of industry, racism as it is today and as it was in Du Bois' time would never have developed as it did. It is fundamentally a rooted in economics. And another way that he intersects race and class is in The Souls of Black Folk when he says, to be a poor man is hard, but to be a poor race in the land of dollars is the very bottom of hardships. So again, he's like, we need to understand the context is largely economic. And this is very Marxist. Um, it's Marxist in that he argues that the root of all of this is capitalism. He will push Marx to think about race a lot more than Marx did and think about colonialism a lot more than Marx, but he really does pull from Marx to say there is something unique about the issue of economics and how it structures life. So I want people to think about and pull together these concepts of if he's borrowing from Marx, that part of the fundamental aspect of humanity, of social life, is the economic sphere, then what does it mean to be human? Do you think he agrees with Marx that to be fundamentally human is to be fundamentally creative and productive? Um, and then how does society affect humanity? And we get a lot more of this in the Black Reconstruction book. Um, that the ways in which capitalism um, reorganizes social life is he gets really into the weeds of the psychology of that, whereas Marx looked mostly at the macro structures. So we're going into race and class that he talks about in Black Reconstruction. Um, this is a news article where Du Bois says communism will triumph, and I want to help bring that day. So Du Bois was unabashedly a communist. He In this article, he's applying for membership in the Communist Party of the U.S., which is fascinating that there was a time when you could be in the newspaper and be a communist. That is not the same anymore. So he did live at a different time. So let's look at how the Reconstruction really changed, or how he reimagined Reconstruction. And I need to change, I'm sorry, I need to change this. page number is incorrect, but I will find the right page number. So he says that Reconstruction was not simply a fight between the white and black races, but was a tremendous series of efforts to earn a living in a new and untried ways, to achieve economic security, and to restore fatal losses of capital and investment. So in all of American history, and even today, we see Reconstruction as a race issue. It was a way for the U.S. to go into the South and to free the slaves and to ensure that there was no retribution against enslaved peoples. And he's saying no. And then in the second bullet point, he argues it was a vast labor movement of both black and white men. It was not simply a race issue, but it was a labor issue. And there was a desperate effort of a ruined oligarchy, so that's talking about kind of the big businesses, to restore, especially of plantations and the economic industries of the North, to restore an anachronism, and that means something that's out of place in the timeline. So in this case, he's saying they were trying to bring past organizations into the present. And so he says, to restore an anachronism in economic organization by force, fraud, and slander. And so the majority of his book is trying to reframe the Reconstruction as a mixture of labor and racial strife, and specifically that there was the opportunity for white and black working class and poor individuals to make a united economic movement, overthrow the capitalist powers, but that the elites were able to sow racial division between them. So he argues that there were 4 types of Reconstruction groups. First, there was the freed black men, which he argued were staggering forward blindly because they were newly free. A lot of them were uneducated. And even if Du Bois was incorrect that the education of newly freed slaves was high, you can imagine at any time if you had a group of people that were at one point forced into labor, had no great power over their own lives, and then suddenly you say, okay, good luck, find your own way, there's going to be some staggering and there's going to be some blindness, right? Second were the Southern white men, and he's specifically talking about poor Southern white men who were suddenly disinherited of land and labor. There were a couple of policies that were made to give freed black men land and jobs, and a lot of Southern white men felt that they were being cast out, that they weren't involved in these policies. And Du Bois actually has quite a bit of sympathy for that. He says that because we focused on race rather than labor, that a lot of these white men felt that they were cast out and forgotten. You had the Northern white men. So these were people from the North, often called like carpetbaggers, who came in who wanted to exploit the sudden economic opportunities of the South. They wanted to buy up the land, they wanted to start hiring people, and they wanted to become the capitalists of the South. And then you had the ruined oligarchy of the South, so the aristocrats, the plantation owners, who were trying to restore their own economic organizations. And you had these 4 different groups that were vying for control, at least over their own. So for freed black men and the poor Southern white men, who were really just trying to make ends meet. And then you had the power brokers who were trying to exploit all of this. So he argues that there were 3 stages to this. First, capitalists needed profit. And building off of Marx, to get profit, you need laborers to work the land and to give you output. And so since capitalists needed profit, you needed laborers. And poor whites and blacks also saw the idea of becoming a part of this new, industry. And they also wanted a part of that profit. And he says that this is when capitalism came in and divided the poor whites and blacks, because if they had united, they could have overthrown the capitalists. But the capitalists created the quote unquote doctrine of racial separation, which overthrew Reconstruction by uniting the planter, or the capitalist, and the poor white, the proletariat, and was against the black laborer, and was far exceeded by its astonishing economic results for the planter. So they went in and they stirred up the racial tensions between poor whites and poor blacks to make sure there was no economic revolution, and instead there was a racial caste put into place in which African Americans were on the bottom and whites were on the top. So if you made it seem to the poor white men that black men were coming to take your jobs and that you would be at the bottom of society, then as poor white men, you would be stirred up into fear of losing your both economic and social position. Any questions on how he's casting Reconstruction?
No.
Okay.
No.
So just digging in a little bit more on doctrine of racial separation. And again, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that I didn't put the page numbers, and I'll get those before I put up the PowerPoint. He calls the doctrine of racial separation an economic strategy to drive a wedge between the white and black workers that there were probably are not today in the world two groups of workers with practically identical interests who hate and fear each other so deeply and persistently, and who are kept so far apart that neither sees anything of common interest. Du Bois is writing this in the 1930s. He wrote Black Reconstruction, which was about the second half of the 1800s. And he's saying that from the 1800s into the 1930s, the racial separation drove such a wedge that even today, or in 1930, and I think he would argue that still today, poor whites and poor blacks have practically identical economic interests, but issues of race keep being stoked by political elites and by media, so that they are kept so far apart and don't do anything together to overthrow the capitalist structures that create that division. The result of this, the bottom quote, was that the wages of both classes could be kept low because you could always threaten them with hiring the other group of labor. And the whites fearing to be supplanted by Negro labor, the Negroes always being threatened by the substitution of white labor. So that is, in sum, his thesis of the history of Reconstruction. And it's important. So Du Bois' PhD is actually in history, not in sociology. And this book is quite the historical tome. He goes, I highly recommend at some point you at least read the chapter summaries before each chapter. He has like a 2-sentence paragraph before every chapter describing what he's going to talk about. And I highly recommend you at least read those, because it will give a sense of the amount of data and detail that he went into in writing this book. So some other themes that come out of this. First is the importance of fear. These are the correct page numbers, by the way. One of the things he talks about and how the northern industries were able to take over was using fear. And he, again, boils it down to economic fear. So he says, he says that the economic elites were able to drive fear in the hearts of poor white men to the point that they became mobs and would massacre African American communities. And he says, how is it that men who want certain things done by brute force can depend on the mob. It can't be explained by total depravity, human hate. Instead, it is the ever shape of fear. And he says, fear of what? Of many things. It could be losing savings, plans for their children, hunger, dirt. But of all of this, the most ubiquitous fear in modern industrial society is that fear of unemployment. So again, he's really reducing this fear, and I guess reducing is the wrong word, but he's identifying the core of the fear as an economic fear. And so as you read this section, note, what is the fear from? How is it weaponized? Who has that power to weaponize fear? And he has a really interesting description of what today we might call fake news, because he says that this fear is rooted in falsehoods. And how do we address those falsehoods? Second, there's the consequences and societal responsibilities for social upheavals like war. He notes that there is a communal, a state, and country responsibility to take care of the economic troubles of people after social upheavals like the Civil War. And he argues that big businesses came in and disrupted those efforts. And that's actually a pretty common phrase to earth. I guess I shouldn't say common, but it's a becoming more accepted truth today, I should say. And I'm going to put in the chat a great book that if anyone's interested in this line, they could use this for any of their choose your own theorist essays. I forgot her. Who wrote the shock doctrine?
Is it Naomi?
It's Naomi. Fine. Thank you. Everyone, congratulate my partner for remembering a theorist that I couldn't. Her name is Naomi.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And she wrote the shock doctrine, which essentially argues that in any big catastrophe, large corporations and industries come in and exploit the catastrophe to gain more wealth and power. She looks at, for example, Katrina, and how after Hurricane Katrina, a lot of finance firms, real estate companies came in and bought up a lot of the land and refused to develop it for poor Black groups that were displaced in Katrina, and instead built, luxury condos or the football arena or things like that, and even destroyed a whole bunch of public schools and created private or magnet schools, like charter schools. And so she's talking about how in a lot of these crises, big businesses come in and use that for their own gain. Third, one thing to point out is he is one of the first scholars to really connect struggles in the U.S. of race and labors to worldwide systems. He talks about how before the Civil War, there was actually quite a lot of migration back to Africa or to Haiti or to other places in the Caribbean, and that issues of colonialism kind of stopped that migration out of the U.S., right? So there was issues of colonialism in the Caribbean, where there was a lot of revolutions and a lot of violence. In Africa, this was the period of colonialism when European powers were really decimating a lot of African states and communities. So he's really one of the first people to connect this racial issue and how it is influenced or could not progress in certain ways because of worldwide systems. And finally, the last chapter, I think, is an excellent treatise on how the consequences of historical revisionism. He shows here is what history books are saying about Black people during slavery and the Civil War. I think he goes on for a couple of pages quoting from textbooks on how they frame slavery in the Civil War. Um, and he says that what are American children taught today about Reconstruction? There are three dominant themes. First, that all Negroes were ignorant. Second, that they were lazy, dishonest, and extravagant. And third, that they were responsible for bad government during Reconstruction. And then he essentially goes through and proves all of those theses wrong, and then explains here's why people are messing up the history of Reconstruction. It's part of this concerted effort to stoke racial division. And so I think today, especially as we're looking at things like critical race theory or how do we teach the hard things of American past, um, who gains from the historical revisionism, who loses, and I think reading this chapter for Du Bois will actually tie a lot into what's going on today. Um, so here's another graph from Du Bois. I'm going to give you some extra concepts to help round out your table with some quotes from other books of Du Bois. First is the idea of race. So we read in ooh, it, sorry, I got confused. He talks a lot about in Black Reconstruction that race is a constructed concept used by capitalists to divide, to the white and black laborers. He calls it the shibboleth of race. He does have a more scientific definition then, and this is from his article, The Conservation of Races, where he says, race is a vast family of human beings, generally of common blood and language, always of a common history, traditions, and impulses, who are both voluntarily and involuntarily striving together for the accomplishment of a certain more or less vividly conceived ideals of life. So I have on the left a kind of breaking it down that race is necessarily a combination of a common history and tradition and impulse that are grouped together in the striving for certain goals. This relates to the social problem definition, if you remember, on how the social problem is when you have a group of people who, because of the social context, are unable to act in the achievement of their goals. And so that's highly connected with his definition of race and doesn't necessarily mean race is biological. He says it often is, because it just so happens that the way we've constructed race is by skin color, which has a common blood type, or a common, not blood type, a common, biological marker. But it's not always, it doesn't have to be that way. Any questions on how he's just defining race? Okay.
No.
Okay, so remember how I said he described that we should be doing science for fact finding first, and then go on to what do we do about it and socials reform. So here at the end of The Souls of Black Folk, the first chapter, he kind of gives that ideal. So he says, work, culture, liberty. All these we need, not singly, but together, not successively, but together. Each growing and aiding each, and all striving toward that vaster ideal that swims before. This is in contrast to a lot of Black activists at the time under the camp of Booker T. Washington who were saying, first let's work, then we'll try to get educated, and then we'll try to get political freedom. And Du Bois says you can't do that. You have to work on this all at the same time. Here we move into what is whiteness. And so this is from the book Souls of, or not a book, it's an essay called Souls of White Folk, in which he says that white people have a lack of racial consciousness. Remember how we talked about the veil produces a double consciousness for African American individuals, But for white folk, it creates a kind of a lack of racial consciousness. And he says, the present attitude and action of the white world is a matter of conditioned reflexes, of long followed habits, custom, and folkways, of subconscious trains of reasoning and unconscious nervous reflexes. Essentially saying white people do a lot of things and they don't know why, whereas African Americans have had to be more critical and thus are able to see a lot of the whys and hows of their culture and of their being. He even says, does the fish in the fishbowl know that it lives in water? As if, African Americans are, this sounds stupid, are non-aquatic and they are put in the fishbowl. They realize that this isn't their environment, whereas the fish don't know anything at all, right? They just assume this is the way it is. So here's just kind of a separation of how he views the black versus white racial consciousness. I I love this description. So he's saying there was a process by which the white folk descended into hell. And by hell, he both means the active persecution of blackness, but also their own psychological and social hell. So he says, first, there was the strut of a southerner or arrogance of an Englishman. Second, there was the generous enthusiasm and paternalism of white folk to, white savior the rest of the world. Third, there was the idea that the white man was humanity and that non-white people were less than human. Fourth, that they had the obligation to spread their nobility to the rest of the world. And finally, that they developed a hatred for anyone who is not white and under them. And he says, am I in my blackness the sole sufferer? There surges in me a vast pity for a people imprisoned and enthralled, hampered and made miserable for such a cause and for such a fantasy. And so he argues that there actually is some psychological suffering when a race has descended into the obsession with hating others. And that creates for them a prison of a social kind of, like a social psychological sort. He ends, one of the endings of his book is kind of reaffirms how he concludes the Black Reconstruction, is that how we discuss our ideals create the nation. And so this is different than Marx. This kind of pushes us more into the realm of Weber, in that cultural ideals do shape our reality. And so he says, a true and worthy ideal frees and uplifts a people. A false ideal imprisons and lowers. Say to men earnestly and repeatedly that honesty is best. Say this and act it, and the nation will move toward it. But say to a people, the one virtue is to be white, and the people rush to the inevitable conclusion that we must destroy the black community. Is not this the record of present America? Are we not coming more and more day by day to making the statement, I am white, the fundamental tenet of our practical morality? And so this really shifts from his arguments that the foundation was economic, that the foundations of social life were economics, to saying, actually, when we create a cultural ideal, it shapes the entire national culture and drive and productivity, right? So if we are able to take control of that national narrative about who we want to be, then we will become that thing, which is more along the lines of how Weber saw capitalism develop in Western Europe. And that's it. I'm not saying you need to know these parts from the Souls of White Folk and from the Conservation of Races, but they will be helpful in filling out that, filling in the gaps for your table that weren't might be harder to decipher from the books we read. And so I highly recommend you just, pull from this to make sense of things. As always, feel free to reach out to me as you're reading and be like, I remember you talked about this, but can you explain what he meant by fear or whatever it is? But otherwise, hopefully this was helpful and interesting. I love Du Bois. I think he's
Yes, this is very fascinating.
yeah. It challenges a lot of the ways that we think, because I even think today we are very focused on race, and I think that disrupts a lot of the potential, economic unions that could be made. Um,
Absolutely.
and how do we get around that? How, like, what are the ideals of the nation that need to be constructed, and how do we get that out? And I think he has a lot to say about what's going on today. So, any questions or anything y'all want to talk about?